nā mate huhu o te wā, haere atura. Maumahara tonu mātau ki a rātau mā, no te mea, nā rātau ko mātau, no reira, moi mai rā, moi mai rā. Ka hoki mai ki a tātou te hunora, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou nā kānohi, tāhito, nā kānohi hou, nau mai, hara mai ki te whare wānanga o Waikato, ko te kaupapa, ko te tangata, ko tātou wēnei. Kei te mihi atu ki te kaupapa. Ka hoki a hau ki te mihi atu ki tō tātou kingi tūheitia, po tātou te wherowhero, te tuāwhitu, ka mihi ki a ia, mō ana manaakitana ki rungi a mātou roti tēnei rohe pōtai o Waikato Tainu, no reira ka nui te mihi ki te whare āriki. E mihi mahana tēnei ki a tātou, nau mai, hara mai, ko tēnei he uri no mātātua waka ko tūhoi, ko te whakatohia, nā te awa, ana ko tāki timu huki, ko nā te kaungunu huki tērā taha. No reira, ko Jason Mika hau, e mihi atu nei ki a tātou. Kia ora everyone, mōrena. It's wonderful to be here. My name's Jason Mika. It's my pleasure to be our MC today on this day where we're talking about benefit sharing. And so it's really awesome that we're gathered here in Whare Tāpere at the University of Waikato by our lake. And so I'm looking forward to today. Now I must have an apology. I have to apologise because it would be our Italian whanaunga, Maui Hudson, coming to you via Te Whakatohea, who would be here, standing here, being your fella's MC today. But unfortunately, he's somewhere in Europe. It's either Europe or New York, I'm not sure which, but I'm hoping that he's busily writing his PhD. It's been a long time coming, and I can't wait to read it. So hopefully the whanaunga is busy on his laptop doing his mahi in Europe or New York or somewhere. But very pleased that he's asked me to step in for him on this occasion. I want to acknowledge our organising committee, Natalie Kusebs, who's unavailable today. She's a bit mawiwi, but Wallace, Maya, Regina, and also the folks here who are running the place, going to feed us today, kahurani. Ko te mea nui o te hui, ko te kai. If the kai's no good, I will, kore taki anō, tērā hui, waiho tērā. But, so we're looking forward to the beautiful kai. Kaurani is taking care of us, feeding us today. But we've also got Ainsley, Stuart, Ryan, who are the crew up there. So if anything tech goes wrong or you need help, we've got the experts who know what they're doing with this stuff there. So we're very blessed with that. And in terms of health and safety, I think we've got a health and safety video coming, or anyway, if that doesn't show up, if you need a plaster, need a Band-Aid or a Panadol, talk to Maya. There's Maya at the back there. Or if you need something more, we'll call someone, get someone to help you out. So health and safety, Maya, follow the crew's instructions if anything goes wrong. And then also I want to say that if you've got any slides that need to be displayed, we've got the crew there. Ryan's going to help us out with that. Now to the kaupapa. Ko te kaupapa o tēnei rangi, ko te benefit sharing. So today's topic, and we have to acknowledge, there's a national science challenge called Science for Technological Innovation. And so we must acknowledge them for their faith in the researchers who have been busily working on this concept of benefit sharing across multiple domains. So nā mihi ki te pūtia tautoko, mō enei rana hau, so acknowledging our science challenge there. The kaupapa of benefit sharing. Now, I'm very interested to learn more about this, so we've got some amazing speakers. So we've got the Aussies are in the house. Where's the Aussies? There's the Aussies. So Australia is in the house. So thank you, Aussie, for coming all the way over here to spend the day with us. So we're very blessed to have you. And we've got a whole range of other experts who are going to share their whakaaro, their thoughts, their ideas about this concept of benefit sharing. So I'm keen to hear more about what that is, how it applies, what are the examples. And so we'll be hearing from a range of speakers on that kaupapa today. Now, the thing with researchers, they're like bureaucrats. They love their acronyms. We love our acronyms, you know. And unless your acronym is a well-known acronym like ACDC, something like that, then please, you know, help us out of here and explain, tell us what you're talking about. So if you use an acronym, if you live in a world where acronyms is your everyday reo, you know, just explain, oh yeah, what is that you're talking about? So any sort of like jargon stuff, explain what that is. We've also got, we've got a few panels to get through today. So we've got a timekeeper, which I'm very pleased to hear about because I'm useless at telling time, keeping to time. So Wallace is going to sort of wave out to us in our panel and just let us know, you know, 5 minutes to go. Come on, we need to give someone else a chance to ask some questions and then let the next panel go. So there'll be time. So if anyone starts singing, that's a sign that, okay. And then if the lights go out, that's when, you know, you really know that its time is up and then someone's going to turn the mics off after that. But, you know, there's a timekeeper involved. And also, just lastly, Wi-Fi. We all want to stay connected. You want to post your messages on LinkedIn and Insta, and there's other ones that I've heard about. I never, you know, TikTok, whatever it is. Wi-Fi is Waikato University. There's no password, so you just tune in there. You'll be good to go. So, any pātai? Any pātai? No, all good to go? Right. Well, we're very blessed to have a couple of keynotes from Australia. We've got Dr. Daniel Robinson and Dr. Miri from Australia who are going to talk about access and benefit sharing as it is experienced and applied in Australia, but also the Pacific. And Dan's just been telling me they've been all over the world in the last 4 weeks. And so we're very blessed to have them turn up on our doorstep to share their knowledge and experience with us. So they'll have about 45 minutes in their slot to share their experiences and knowledge with us. Health and safety. Can't move until we've got health and safety instructions, so we'll let that roll momentarily.
Kia ora koutou and welcome to the Gallagher Academy of Performing Arts. Before we get underway, we would like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping points to ensure you enjoy your time here with us. Please note, toilets are located opposite the Opus Bar in the centre of the main foyer. Please note that photography and filming is prohibited for the duration of this event. And lastly, please take a moment to locate your nearest exit. In the unlikely event of an emergency, you'll be asked to vacate the room in an orderly fashion. Please follow the instructions of event and academy staff who will guide you to the assembly area. Thank you for your attention. We hope you enjoyed today's event.
I hope you enjoy it too. Just on the photos, we've got a photographer coming in who's going to take some few snaps. So if you don't want your face on Facebook and Instagram and the Waikato University website, then just let the photographer know or just shuffle out of the road. You know, hopefully you enjoy the day. So going to hand it over to our keynotes to come and give us their address. So big hand to Paki for Dr. Dan and Dr. Miri Raven.
last day. Kia ora. How's everyone? Awake? I'm not quite. So please excuse me. I am from Western Australia originally. My name is actually Margaret, and I changed it to Miri. My mother's name is Margaret. I'm Noongar from Western Australia, so that's the southwest, and I have 3 tribes. Happy to talk about those tribes if you want. Also, I have an identical twin sister, and her name is Tui. So it's so nice to have her sitting next to me. She's identical, so we do look the same. So if you may have met her, not me, because she's working in a very similar space. Also, my father is actually from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and my grandmother used to live in Katikati. Not far. Is it that direction? That direction. That direction? Which way is it? That way. I'm so disorientated. I think it's the other way around. So Dan and I have been working on it. Daniel will introduce himself. Dan and I have been working on a project funded by the Australian Research Council called Indigenous Knowledge Futures, and there's 2 main components to the project. This will get me through it. Oh, look at this. So we've got 2 projects. Dan has done mostly the work on the second project, and we've worked together on the first one. It's a project funded by the Australian government, and there's 2 or 3 main components. So one of the things that we do is to look at patents, to go through patents on traditional knowledge on plants in Australia in particular, and to find out if there's any someone's claimed knowledge on the traditional knowledge. The process for that is to go into a patent database, and we use ethnobotanical texts to do that. The other part of the project is to look at particular species. So based on what comes out of the patent analysis, we go and have a look at a particular species. So we've got quite a few of those. We've done one on emu because there's quite a lot of patents on emu oil in the US, and emu is quite a significant animal in Australia. I need to go and get my water.
Maybe I'll just also say, while she's getting water, we're from the University of New South Wales, and we should acknowledge we're from Bidjigal country, so UNSW is on the lands of the Bidjigal people, so we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging from the Bidjigal people. But also thank you for your welcome here, Jason, and thanks for inviting us. Back to you.
Yeah, and how funny I do protocols, I always forget acknowledgement. It's always the big thing that I forget. And the other part that we're doing is we're looking at protocols as well as ABS. And so protocols is just a fancy way of saying customary law and practices, and then ABS agreements. And then, do you want to talk about this project?
Miri was involved in part of this project. So this was the Access and Benefit Sharing Capacity Development Initiative. We had a joint project with the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP. Many of you may know SPREP. So we had a joint project with them for 5 years implementing the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biodiversity. So that finished just a couple of years ago. That was funded by the EU and GIZ, so a bunch of European partners. And we led that component through UNSW in Melanesia particularly. So we're really, with that project, we were focusing on the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing and how we would implement that in the Pacific Island countries. So with SPREP, we supported 10 of the Pacific countries to implement the Nagoya Protocol. And we did a bit of other work on looking at biotrade value chains and how we could get ABS compliance within those. We also did some work with Indigenous peoples in terms of awareness, but also in terms of looking at where they could be better involved in those value chains as well. But COVID interrupted a whole bunch of that, so it was a bit of a bummer. For a couple of years, we're trying to do that sort of work online is very difficult in the Pacific. So I can talk more about that later.
And just before I go to the next slide, so that project, the first project is in Vanuatu, Cook Islands, and quite a few places in Australia. Obviously, we can't get into Vanuatu at the moment. There's no airline, and so we're not sure what we're going to do in that respect. But obviously, our project's the least of the worries in Vanuatu. These people can't get around to see each other and do everyday business, so... Is everyone in the room familiar with the Nagoya Protocol? So I don't need to go over it. For the most part, everyone knows what it is. So the bit that we focus on in the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biodiversity are the two main aspects around recognising protocols, so cultural protocols or biocultural protocols. It depends on whatever term you want to use. And recognising it is in a couple of ways. One is just at the kind of with Indigenous communities or Indigenous businesses, also right to the extent that they are trying to do in Vanuatu and the Cook Islands to recognise those customary protocols in law, in legislation, as the basis for when a dispute arises that there's an existing protocol. And then the other part, obviously, is the ABS stuff. So we've managed to do a few protocols. So probably the most comprehensive so far is the one in Arataki. It's the Taonga Varaku Māori protocol. And so this is actually with a network of traditional healers. We do an extent of protocols from plant-based or species-based right through to network. So this is a group of healers in Arataki who've gotten together, who've decided they still want to be able to maintain practices around healing, and they want to know that they can share knowledge amongst themselves without it going to the wrong people. And they're at the stage where they're trying to decide, how do they protect that particular knowledge? Do they put it in a book? Does it end up in a database? And then how do they interact as an entity themselves with the Cook Islands government, but also the other tiers for traditional governance in the Cook Islands? It's got two main sections. The first section is the background to the document, and then it's got a whole lot of rules that we developed with them over the course of about 3 or 4 meetings. It's in English, but it's also in Cook Islands Māori, and that's because it's for the traditional healers. The English version was really for us to be able to work through and to talk about it with other people outside of the Cook Islands. But this particular protocol is actually in Cook Islands Māori, which I think is fantastic. The conversations were quite interesting because I'm sure it's the same here. Traditional knowledge in Arataki is held by an individual. It's not held by a family, it's held by a particular individual person. And if you want to go and get healing, you go to that person and you stay with that person. They won't give you the medicine, they won't tell you what's in it, and you have to follow the particular rules. And so in the protocol itself are the rules around what do you do when you go and see a traditional healer, what are your responsibilities as a person taking the medicine, who can you tell about that particular medicine. The other protocol that we are doing, but the other protocol that we're supporting development of is in another island in Archu, and they have a slightly different approach. For them, the issue is the loss of the plants. So if you go to collect them, they're currently being eradicated with herbicides, so their conversation is slightly different, and they're looking more towards setting up in the community their own traditional medicine garden that's behind a locked gate that is like a sui generis, like gene bank essentially, and that there'll be a protocol around that. And what's that noise? And we will be going back later this year to work with them on that. And this one we just went back before the airlines went bust. This is a huge sign. It's on the edge of a protected area. the community there said, we just want a big sign, that they'd lost a previous sign in a cyclone, and they wanted a sign set up that actually told people about when they go into this area, what are their obligations. So this particular protected area has a significant bird in it. So they don't want you to take that bird. And one of the main things, so we also had to perform this custom as well, is like performing a Nolan custom before entering, and it's different depending on who you are. So I'm a woman, so I can't drink kava, but Dan got to drink the strongest kava I think I've ever seen. I don't think he could walk properly after that. It was very strong. So that particular custom was separating out the men and the women went somewhere else, and the men did the particular custom in order to be accepted in that particular area. And no hunting. And so this is like, for us, looks very simple as a protocol, but these are important practices, and it sits right outside the actual community to go in. So when we talk about putting protocols down into writing or codifying them, it's a whole gamut of things. So we haven't heard it yet, but we know that in the north, Vanuatu, Cook Islands, the song. It is Cook Islands. In the north of the Cook Islands, there's a song cycle with their cultural protocols, so they don't write it down. So for us as Indigenous people, our protocols were never written down. They were existed in customary practices, and some communities are choosing to use that as a mode. So some of the conversations that we will be having going forward is like, this is one way of doing it, putting it into a document, but actually, is there a story that can be told? Like, is there a story that goes with this plant? Is there a dance that goes with it? Is there a song? Because writing it down on paper is fine, but how are you going to remember it? How are you going to carry it inside and remember it, and how are you going to pass it on? So that's the other part of protocol. I think that's me for this. Oh, and the last one. This one, I actually wasn't here for this. I was overseas, so Daniel did most of the discussions around this. The other approach is to work specifically with a plant or a particular species, and language is problematic in this space. Calling a plant a species puts it into a very scientific-based way, and we know that plants are not species, so to speak. They have their own way of being classified. They have their own relationships to other plants, and it's problematic, but we're calling them species protocols. And the idea is to have a protocol at a point of sale. So this one's a point of sale protocol. So when you go and buy a particular plant or a sample of a plant, this protocol is attached to it. And it basically says that you can use this in Australia. You can't claim intellectual property rights on it. You can't resell the seeds, you can't do any research on it. Now, obviously the bit that's difficult about this is a contract. This is essentially a contract, which is what an ABS is. But how do you deal with someone who breaches this particular contract? And so the other part of this, which is a technical piece, how do you track it? The other part of this is, I'm not sure if they're doing it, but you could, when you go and pay for something, Australia's mostly, there's no cash anymore for the most part in Australia. When you pay for things and you pay for it on a card, there is an option to put in a particular question. So I don't know if you've bought anything lately and they've said, how are your services? Or can you just do this little survey before you pay? So you could put it at that point of sale. So when someone pays, so you give them this copy, and then when they pay, they have to press yes or no to say that they've agreed. So you have a system to track the person's details plus the point of sale plus the contract, which is a technical fix. And I think that's me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kakadu Plum.
Thanks, Miri. So we thought it was important to talk about customary law and protocols to start with, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this thing called biopiracy, and then also benefit sharing agreements, basically, with some examples. We want to give you positive examples because sometimes talking about biopiracy gets really negative. We get sad. There's a whole bunch of issues, as I think a lot of us know, around patenting and misappropriation through intellectual property. And it can happen in all sorts of different ways. There's the cultural expression side of things, where artworks and stories are being misappropriated. And then we tend to work on the bush food medicine side of things, where those plants and animals are being researched and patented, and sometimes it's very much based on the Indigenous knowledge. We use patent landscaping as one tool in our toolkit of different methods and activities to try to identify what research is happening on plants and animals. And we use the term plants and animals instead of genetic resource to make it feel a bit more tangible, because genetic resource sounds like it strips the identity of the thing. So Kakadu plum is a really well-known one. It has heaps of different local names. So Kakadu plum actually is a kind of a disputed name, but it's becoming a very marketable name. So gubbinge in the Kimberleys and other names. There's a whole heap of patents happening on this. And so you can see we use patent lens to sort of chart these things over time. Depends how you do the search. In this case, it's abstract title claims. We do a search within patent lens of usually just the scientific name or a keyword name like Kakadu plum. And a number of different, there's a range of different patents occurring that utilise Kakadu plum as an extract in a composition for skincare or for other uses within foods and things like that. So Kakadu plum is endemic to Northern Australia. It's been used for thousands of years by a range of different Indigenous peoples. And it's the world's highest source of vitamin C. There's another. It is being mixed with a number of other ingredients that have been used by Indigenous people as well. There are companies such as Miri Cosmetics, which seems to be the lead applicant on many of these applications, that has been utilising and claiming a number of patents on these things. We've actually challenged some of these patents, and so that's one of the things that we do. So we use pre- and post-grant oppositions through IP Australia. So we're doing that domestically. It's much harder to do that in the US. It's very expensive. You have to go to court. You can be found liable for costs if you fail in a court opposition. So we don't do that. That's too expensive. That's beyond what we can do. But we can do administrative pre- and post-grant oppositions under the Australian Patent Act. And so we've done 2 of those with our Indigenous colleagues and Bush Foods enterprises successfully to challenge and defeat patents where we thought they were quite spurious or very much based on traditional knowledge and problematic for some of those reasons. So one of the Mary Kay ones was defeated. There was also there's been a lot of trademark filings for Kakadu plum and some other ones. There's also been some successful challenges on the trademarks that were concerning, but in relation to another species. I put this in just the other day, a couple of days ago, just to see what's happening. So Patent Lens is a really useful tool if you want to have a look at these things. You can literally find these results in, this took me 5 minutes. It's called thelens.org, and it's an open international search tool developed in Queensland, I believe. It's really useful. I just put the term Manuka in, and in abstract title claims as a search. And so you can see the trend is skyrocketing. There is a huge amount of research, and I just did this as one example. A few years ago with a few colleagues here in Aotearoa, Jessica Lai was the main author. We did a much broader search of a range of different species as well. And we use this as a tool to kind of say, look, there's an issue here. Like there's a lot of activity. A lot of these patents might be technically valid, but are the researchers getting permission? Are they setting up benefit sharing agreements? Is it fair and equitable? So we want to ask those questions. We want to be a little bit provocative about all that sort of thing. So you can see they're at different stages. A lot are at the application stage. A lot of those might fall out. But you can see the distribution as well, a lot in the US. The US hasn't ratified Nagoya Protocol and all of the Convention on Biodiversity. They probably never will. And so that's obviously a challenge that we'll have internationally. A lot are filed internationally in WIPO as well, so they'll go to multiple countries. So there's a whole range of different fields for those. And out of the big, that big group, there's only a few actually that are actually filed in New Zealand. So it's obviously an international scale challenge dealing with these things.
And we're not happy about Australia.
Yes, and there are obviously some in Australia too.
We're not happy about that.
Yeah. So there's a number of access and benefit sharing case studies that I've been doing over the years. And I originally did a book about biopiracy, and one of the reviews kind of said, we need positive case studies as well. So I started looking at positive case studies to try and find where we have access and benefit sharing, where it might be fair and equitable. And some of the better ones that I found actually were in this region and then a few other places as well. One that gets talked about a lot is in Cook Islands, and this is partly why we started looking at protocols in the Cook Islands as well. So around 2012, I started looking at this. This is SimTech, or Cook Islands Medical Technologies, and this is actually their facility in the back of Avarua, if anyone's been to Rarotonga. It's behind the airport, sort of, up the hill a little bit. And so a researcher, Dr. Graham Matheson, a Cook Island Maori man, he had been studying medical science, to become an orthopaedic surgeon in Sydney, and he had played rugby as a young man, had seen people break bones, and then traditional healers sort of wrap it in a poultice and treat those broken bones, and they would heal rapidly. And he remembered this when he was studying in Sydney. And so he wanted to do that as part of his research as a master's and PhD student, and got permission from the Kotunui. So the Kotunui are it's useful for access and benefit sharing in this case that Cook Islands has a constitutionally recognised, two constitutionally recognised Indigenous bodies. The House of Ariki, so the paramount chiefs, and then they have the Kotunui who are sub-district chiefs. The sub-district chiefs, the Kotunui, are very much charged with cultural affairs and preserving knowledge. And so Dr. Matheson set up an agreement with the Kotunui and made them shareholders and joint patent holders of the research that he was working on. Got permission to study the formula. He reformulated it a bit, but got permission to study the formula, and the access and benefit sharing agreement they set up, there's no national legislation still in Cook Islands. He did this because he thought it was the right thing to do. He made them a shareholder and a joint patent holder, so they do have a say in sort of how things progress with the research. There is a product on the market, there's actually a skincare product, so that puts money into the research and also activities in Rarotonga, particularly, I'll come to it, there's a particularly in a thing called ROE, which is protected areas. These are just pictures of the laboratory. So there's a number of benefits in this case. There's sort of monetary and non-monetary benefits. It's important to recognise that there can be monetary and non-monetary benefits. Joint IP can be one benefit. Shareholding, joint, technology transfer. Technology transfer is a big deal in this particular case because in Cook Islands there's no similar laboratory to this. This is the first of its kind, where you can do a whole range of different testing, environmental testing, plant and soil, water quality testing, etc. He's using the laboratory there to do plant extracts that go into the skincare, but also the research for the bone healing drug. Some of the funding goes back towards conservation, which is the original idea with Convention on Biodiversity and Nagoya Protocol, is that it also should go towards conservation, but also to Indigenous people and traditional protection of traditional knowledge. So this is part of it. The Kotunui are very much involved in Ra'ui, or Indigenous protected areas, basically. And they can be on land and sea. So that's quite a positive one. There's a number of different agreements that we've looked at around the region. One that's particularly interesting was a US-led group, the ICBG, so International Cooperative Biodiversity Group, funded by the US National Institute of Health. They were doing a number of these projects around the world for a decade or so, a little bit more actually, nearly 20 years. And they had one of these projects in PNG, They had a number of industry partners, screened a bunch of forest genetic resources, I think some other genetic resources, probably marine as well. And in the benefit sharing, a lot of the benefit sharing agreement was set up around the University of UPNG. And some of the things that they requested were like a new laboratory like this herpetarium, which is set up to milk the venom from venomous snakes, and we have a lot of those in Australia, so I can empathise. So they have some of the same snakes, very deadly, were killing a lot of people in the bush. So this was critical for saving lives, basically. So this was one of the demands in the benefit sharing agreement between the US and the UPNG partners. They also did a whole range of things. So there was monetary benefit sharing for communities and chiefs. They would do medical testing for communities in villages when they'd go out to villages in remote forest areas. They'd do optometry clinics. They also validated some traditional medicines for safety and improved the formulation for safety. So that's the other picture here with Miri, was they were helping her reformulate some of the medicines that she was producing. There's a number of Australian examples as well. The top one is a guy called Colin Saltmere, is the traditional owner. He's been collaborating with UQ, University of Queensland, on research on spinifex grasses, on a range of different, as a fibre, like a material for a range of different purposes. And there's a benefit sharing agreement that he's set up, and that's been long-standing, that's been going for quite a long time. So a range of things like tyres, roads, condoms and surgical gloves, because it's got those sort of qualities. And when we were doing the patent landscape, I remember there's a lot of material interest in New Zealand flax, actually, and quite a few patents that were happening. Similar sort of idea about the material uses of New Zealand flax. John is going to talk about the second one there, so I'll let John talk about that later. And there's a number of new ABS agreements. There's at least one or two new ABS agreements occurring under the Queensland Biodiscovery Act, so we have a new act in Queensland. But that's all sort of work in progress still, because it's a relatively new act from 2020. I really like this example. This is Moroccan argan oil, just to give you another international example very quickly. This is between like the Body Shop, L'Oreal, some European intermediary companies. It's a big, complicated global value chain. And Amazigh women in Morocco have more than 1,000 years of documented knowledge of argan oil. Many people in the room, I think particularly women, will know argan oil because it's in shampoos and conditioners. It's also useful in skin cares and creams and things like that, body butters like in that picture there. It does have a number of really useful qualities for skin care and hair care. And the Amazigh women have known this for 1,000 years or more, probably more. The companies involved set up benefit sharing agreements kind of as a test run for doing broader agreements. So L'Oreal was involved in this and were veering into natural products. They bought the Body Shop for several years, and this was one of their sort of key platforms. So it was important that they had an access and benefit sharing agreement to kind of, market it and say that they were doing the right thing and all that sort of thing. And so in this case, there are sort of hundreds of thousands of euros in monetary benefits going to women's cooperatives. Increasingly, men are getting involved in the cooperatives, and argan is strictly women's business, but that's another long story. But there's a lot of benefits for the women's cooperatives. They've literally built women's cooperatives. They've put in all these facilities. They built creches. They're doing literacy, again, optometry, healthcare clinics for communities. They pay for weddings. There's a huge range of benefits, monetary particularly, but also training and other non-monetary benefits in this particular case. So there's a lot more to tell you about this, as I've written a whole book about it. So there's a bunch of different ABS laws in Australia. These are quite outdated, actually. So sometimes people look to Australia and go, oh, look, Australia's had heaps of these laws since 2000. Yeah, but they weren't very good. So we have a few laws that do access and benefit sharing, but it's important to recognise that they were done pre-Nagoya Protocol, and the only one that's been updated actually is the Queensland law in 2020. And they have a traditional knowledge code of conduct, which I think is a really important part of how that Queensland law operates. So really, Queensland is the one that's Nagoya compliant. The Australian law is almost Nagoya compliant, you would say, but it does need to be updated. Australia hasn't ratified Nagoya Protocol, but they signed it, and politics have probably got in the way, I'd say. There is quite a lot of activity with IP Australia on Indigenous knowledge currently, and I think we're making some progress. There's some important steps happening. So maybe copying New Zealand, they're looking at an Indigenous advisory committee on patents and trademarks, and it's going to happen very soon. Actually, they've put out a tender for people to sit on those committees. So I think that will be one important step forward. They're also looking at sui generis traditional knowledge type law, among other things, and disclosure of origin as a possible solution for some of these issues. There's other laws in the region as well. I don't have time to go through them in a lot of detail, but Vanuatu, we've been working closely with Vanuatu currently in relation to their traditional knowledge law. And then Cook Islands have a Traditional Knowledge Act, and the protocols we've been working on in those two countries, we're hoping will get formally recognised or even informally recognised under those laws. I can tell you more about those if people have questions. There's obviously the new WIPO Treaty just recently. I see some colleagues here that were in Geneva a couple of weeks ago. So this was just in May, just a few weeks back. We were there in Geneva. The new treaty, it's a technical treaty really. It was being talked about as a transparency measure for patents. So it focuses on disclosure of origin of traditional knowledge and genetic resources in patents. There were big discussions on the terms of that and how broad or how narrow the language should be around disclosure of origin. There were really difficult discussions about sanctions and remedies, about revocation of patents, and ultimately that was sort of pushed out of the language. But there are provisions on sanctions and remedies in the treaty. And then also, the Indigenous Caucus was concerned about how the information systems, databases of traditional knowledge might operate, and making sure that those had rules around them to make sure that if databases were being used by patent examiners, that there were limitations put on those and restrictions on access and things like that, so that not everyone can just sort of access that traditional knowledge if it's being put into databases. So there's a lot to talk about as well, obviously, with the treaty, but we can sort of discuss that today, I think. And it's brand new, so we're all sort of thinking about it, how that might operate. There's a million lessons from the ABS case studies. I think there's still some big problems with access and benefit sharing under Nagoya Protocol. It's obviously not a perfect system. There's plenty of circumvention of ABS that happens. So the US is non-compliant. Basically, we see that all the time, that the companies are blatantly using a genetic resource, researching it, filing patents, no ABS agreement. And often US companies in the Pacific, we've seen them get around this through biotrade. So they're buying the genetic resource from a supplier and saying it's just for commercial use, but then they do the research and development on it. So we're seeing that happen all the time in Vanuatu and in other parts of the Pacific as well. DSI, or digital sequence information, so genomic sequencing is a big one as well. And that's again, really important, particularly in some sectors like pharmaceuticals and biotechnologies. That's another way in which researchers are circumventing ABS. But the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework talks about the need to think about DSI in the context of ABS, that we should be thinking about integrating these and how do we do that effectively. and that's a long conversation. That's going to be complicated. There's a bunch of different lessons. So the EU ABS laws are pushing compliance down value chains. We've seen that in the Pacific, where a company, an intermediary company, is selling to Aveda, for example, in Europe. And because Aveda has to be compliant, it has, the intermediary has to be compliant right down to the bottom in Vanuatu. So they're doing benefit sharing, but they're doing a terrible job of it sometimes. So they'll buy 10 cases of beer for a community. Literally, this was benefit sharing for one particular case. So we've been trying to generate awareness about doing better benefit sharing. So the community, what does the community want? They wanted wells, they wanted facilities to help them improve their business, etc. So they, clearly ABS can be done poorly. In other cases, it can be done well. It requires trust. Social license to operate is really important. It's important for the PR of the business. They can market that they're doing ABS. In the SimTech case, it's on the packet. It says we're doing access and benefit sharing. It's fair and equitable. So they're using it as a tool. This has been happening in Southern Africa. So some of the cases in Southern Africa were a disaster to start with. It was a PR disaster to do with Huria, Nestle and Rooibos. And then they've tried to turn it around and say, no, we're doing benefit sharing now. So they've used it sort of as a tool to turn around the negative attention towards positive attention. And then there's particular sectors that I think that are looking more at ABS compliant biotrade. So we talk to organisations like Union for Ethical Biotrade quite often, and they're working actively, particularly with foods and cosmetics a lot. And those sectors seem particularly amenable because they keep buying. There's a value chain. There's a supply chain of those natural products going to a high-end product. So there's definitely a bit more interest in those sectors too. I should probably wind up so that there's questions. But there's lots of things that we can do together. These are just a few ideas. But yeah, we're happy to answer any questions and talk more about some of these issues and try to sort of fill some of these gaps, or try to do ABS better, try to protect Indigenous knowledge through a range of different mechanisms. All right, I'll stop there. So there's a bit of time for questions. Thank you. It's okay.
Before we go to questions, I've got a question. Kia ora. That was an awesome presentation. There's just so many questions actually, and one of them is that you talked about cover and getting heavy on cover. And my wife's Tongan, and I've tried cover, and it's pretty heavy going. And so I just wanted to know if you've sort of looked at cover and how that's sort of being dealt with in terms of access and benefit sharing, in terms of its development internationally. You want to just comment on that before we open it up?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have a paper on Carver a couple of years ago. So there's something like 300 patents. It depends how you define, how many patents there are. But there's like 150 patent families. So internationally filed patents relating to Carver. Some are concerning because they're quite close to traditional uses as a beverage or something that causes a relaxant effect. So yeah, like you say, it can numb you. If you haven't used Carver, it can numb your face a bit and makes you a bit sleepy. It's not like alcohol, because alcohol's an upper and Carver's a bit of a downer. It makes you sleepy, and it's quite good actually for helping you sleep. So a lot of researchers are looking at those sort of uses. There's a range of other uses they're looking at too, which are quite different to the traditional knowledge. But it's caused a lot of concern in Vanuatu, where they have 40-something local noble varieties that you can drink. And so it's a centre of diversity, really. There's a lot of concern. There are a lot of bio-traders selling Carver at the airports, exporting it to other users, and there's worry that bio-trade actually is getting picked up by companies without doing the benefit sharing. There's one case where we can see there is a bit of benefit sharing with Vanuatu, but again, it's one of those things where they're sponsoring the football team, and we're like, it could be a bit more comprehensive and could do something a bit better than that. Yeah. So that's a really good example, and it's become a big worry in the Pacific, definitely. Yeah.
Question from the floor. We've got Katie Lee's up the mic. Yep, hand up back there.
I have a question, John, linked to how do we, okay, I might try this. How do you see the movement to bring the benefits closer to the community? And I'm thinking about some of the examples you've given, let's say the body shop. I expect that there is some sort of governance in the country that will ensure that that monetary reward gets actually fairly and equitably shared at a community level. What is the evolution of these governance models at the grassroots? Because that's, in fact, where we want to capture most of the benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, and cultural. Miri's just saying cultural governance is really important, and I think that's a really good point. So in some contexts, the cultural governance is really clear and strong. So in Vanuatu, when we work there, there's really strong custom and customary law. So it's often really clear who traditional owners of knowledge are or knowledge holders are. In other contexts, like in Australia, there's a lot of impact from colonisation. So when we go and talk to remote communities, it can be much more complicated, and layers of colonial baggage and complexity in how those negotiations might occur. So cultural governance is really important. Sometimes, like the Moroccan case is interesting because they left the government out. Sometimes it works better if you leave the government out. Sometimes the government is an important stakeholder and can help facilitate making sure, basically, that compliance from the researchers. So in Vanuatu, the government's trying to be a facilitator to make sure that the community is involved. So the government kind of just facilitates the discussion in Vanuatu, and that works pretty well. The government kind of facilitates and then kind of steps out and issues a permit. In Morocco, the government didn't have anything in place, and so some enterprising academics helped set up women's cooperatives. The women's cooperatives did the negotiations, themselves. The women in the communities did the negotiations with some of the big enterprises themselves, and I think the Moroccan professor Zabida Sharouf, she helped with the negotiation. She got lawyers, to help with the negotiation, and that ended up with a really good outcome. I think also because the companies were really willing and they wanted to use it as a case study and kind of say, look at this stuff that we're doing. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll add one other part. So in Victoria, they have the impact of colonisation has been really bad, and so they are revitalising their own traditional knowledge and in the process working out the stories. So that cultural governance is not something that comes from people. So the cultural governance comes from country, it comes from plants. So the plants have their own stories, and the person that knows the stories for that plant is the one that the cultural governance goes through. So for those places where you're revitalising culture and trying to create a cultural governance around it, they're building it through, like, what are the stories? What's the myth for that place? What's the story of how it was, how was it formed? And what are the stories for those plants? And so for those places that don't have a robust cultural governance, the way to rebuild it and to make sure that it doesn't fall over is to go right back to country and to go back to plants and to build it from there.
One more question.
Hello, is this working? My name is Sandra. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. I'm just wondering, like, benefit sharing, when we talk about benefit sharing, we are talking as well about property rights and stakeholders. How do you map? So I'm just thinking, how do you define an ABS that is fair and equitable between multiple stakeholders, especially when they are several communities, and some of those might not be aware of the agreement. So how to guarantee that this is not only between the companies that are negotiating with the communities, but also within the communities?
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges with how the Nagoya Protocol is drafted, actually, because it talks about providers of the genetic resource and associated traditional knowledge. So in theory, a researcher or a company can find an ideal candidate, in a sense, and someone who's willing to negotiate, and there's been lots of examples of this around the world. So that's often what happens. They'll find the willing collaborator. I mean, there's been the cases in Australia have been interesting, and John will talk about those later. That is a challenge. That is a big problem. We had a bunch of researchers, for example, come from Europe who'd been profiling the Eremophila genus in Australia, endemic to Australia. It's called emu bush in many places, and it's a sacred species for a lot of communities as well. They had no idea who to make an agreement with, and they're still trying to figure it out. And that is a real challenge, especially for a genus. That's a whole genus. It's not just a species, it's a whole bunch of species. And they were doing genetic profiling of the whole genus. They wanted to do benefit sharing. They were trying to set up funds in the Kimberleys, just because there was interest in collaboration in the Kimberleys, for example. But then that would leave other people out. There isn't an easy solution for this. I think sometimes so in Australia, there's a bit of a conversation around having a culturally competent national authority. That's, I think, Terry Janke's idea, to have a sort of an Indigenous body that can help negotiate who speaks for a particular plant, traditional knowledge, etc. Who is the right person for the right country, people say in Australia. Right person for right country, or right person for right knowledge as well. So that's one idea that's kind of been put up and there's a number of people that have been looking at this, having a culturally competent national authority to deal with these sorts of issues. But then I know in the intellectual property context, IP officers have been approaching it in a slightly different way. They've kind of said, well, we need an Indigenous advisory body to work it at the patent end of things. So yeah, there's two different concurrent ideas sort of going on. Yeah. But it's a huge challenge.
Jonah, just like to thank our guests one more time. So, paki mai. It's an awesome presentation. Thank you.